Last Ceann Comhairle, Minister and Deputies must be wondering why Fianna Fáil is raising the issue of mortgage arrears again, given that it was only a couple of months ago that we dedicated a private member's motion to the issue of how the mortgage arrears crisis is being dealt with. And I think, Minister, the reason why we are raising the issue again is primarily because of the startling evidence given by the banks before the Joint Oireachtas Finance Committee 2 weeks ago. We had 3 days of hearings with AIB, Bank of Ireland, Ulster Bank and Permanent TSB. And I think by any measure, the evidence that they gave was absolutely astounding. The purpose of the motion, Minister, is essentially to stimulate further debate and, more importantly, action on the single greatest social and economic challenge that this country is facing at this point in time. As I mentioned last Ceann Comhairle, the evidence that was given by the banks 2 weeks ago took me by surprise. I think it took every government deputy who was present by surprise as well, and I think it probably even took the government by surprise. Because to be fair to government and the central bank, and I'll be critical of both in a moment, but when the targets were issued last March, I am sure that the last thing that both government and central bank expected to happen was that up to 15,000 letters would be issued by the banks to those in mortgage arrears, either commencing legal action or else threatening that legal action would commence. But unfortunately, that has been the result of the banks attempting to reach the targets that were set for them in the quarter ending the end of June in the current year. And just to go through the figures, the overall number of letters is up to 15,000 issued in Q2, arising from the targets that were issued. In AIB's case, 74% of their solutions which were offered involved the threat of legal action to repossess the home or its voluntary sale by the homeowner. In the case of Bank of Ireland, 49% of their sustainable solutions reported to the central bank involved the commencement of legal proceedings to repossess the home. In Ulster Bank, 80% of their so-called solutions for owner-occupiers in arrears was the commencement of legal action to repossess, and in the case of Permanent TSB, 36% of their solutions were voluntary sale by the homeowner or the commencement of legal proceedings. That is the evidence that we received by the banks just 2 weeks ago at the Joint Oireachtas Committee hearing, and I think it did startle all of the deputies and senators who were present and who certainly did not expect that would be the response from banks to the mortgage arrears targets that were set by the government and indeed the central bank back in March. And I think, last Ceann Comhairle, much of this really goes back to the commencement of the process of setting these targets back in March, which in my view, and I said it at the time, was flawed, because the definition of a sustainable solution was too vague, and ultimately it was up to the banks to decide what a sustainable solution to a person's mortgage arrears problem was. And actually, when you examine the definition that was provided in the Mortgage Arrears Resolution Targets Programme, the banks must satisfy themselves that the solution is sustainable, and it could include the property being voluntarily sold, or failing that, the repossession of the property by way of a voluntary agreement by the bank or indeed by way of a court order. So the banks, in effect, were perfectly within their rights to say that the majority of the solutions that they were offering to borrowers were represented by the threat of legal action or the actual commencement of legal action to repossess the family home. And that was a flaw in the process from the very beginning. And let's be very clear about this. When government and central bank put their faith in these targets, the reaching of sustainable solutions, I do not believe that either envisaged that the repossession of the home would be deemed to be the sustainable solution. And let's be very clear about it. Anything that involves the loss of the family home, whether it be by way of voluntary surrender or forced repossession as a result of legal proceedings, is not a sustainable solution to the mortgage arrears. That is a termination of the mortgage, because that is in effect what the outcome of that is. It's not a solution to mortgage arrears, it's a termination of the mortgage account, and I think we should be very clear and very honest about that. And I have to say that the most depressing thing that I took from those hearings 2 weeks ago was the feeling that the banks still don't really get it, that they don't really grasp what is required of them, the need to engage meaningfully with borrowers who genuinely want to work to keep the family home, as I believe is the case in the vast majority of situations. Dealing with the motion, last Ciaran Corla, there are a number of important points I want to make. Firstly, we still have no independent verification from the central bank of the bank's performance against the targets that were set for Q2 to the end of June. And I have to say, I find that is unacceptable. And I know Governor Honohan will be coming before the committee next week, and we will have an opportunity to question him then. But since last March, the central bank and government knew that the first set of targets related to the period to the end of June. So why did audits not commence of the bank's performance in the month of July? Why is it that here we are in mid-September and we still have no handle whatsoever of any independent verification of the bank's performance? In fact, my understanding is that that process of auditing the bank's performance hasn't even commenced. Why did that not commence in July when the targets were supposedly met by the end of June? I think that's an important point to make. The second point which we're calling for in the motion is for targets to be set for concluded agreements. And I welcome the fact that the central bank yesterday moved to issue the first set of targets for the actual conclusion of agreements. In other words, that banks would no longer merely be required to make offers, but now would be required to actually conclude agreements with borrowers. 15% of them must have concluded by the end of December, and that is increasing then to 25% by the end of March. That is a step in the right direction. Those targets should have been set long before now, in my view. And, Minister, I have to say that the government counter motion, which I assume was approved by government and cabinet today, is still out of date. It's actually out of date already, because it makes no reference to the fact that the central bank yesterday issued those targets. It refers to those targets being set shortly, and I think that is lazy, to be honest with you, and I think it is indicative of the lack of priority that this issue has been given. But I welcome the fact that those targets have now commenced in relation to the conclusion of actual agreements. We have said from quite early on that there should be a legal right to borrowers in arrears to a sustainable solution to their mortgage arrears problem if they meet certain qualifying criteria. And when you look at the forbearance arrangements that are still being rolled out by the banks, there is a marked reluctance to offer the more long-term sustainable solutions. And we have advocated for quite some time that there is a need for an independent mortgage resolution office. I believe that that could sit within the new Insolvency Service of Ireland, and it could adjudicate and have the final say in respect of mortgage arrears, subject to overarching guidelines that would be issued. I think that is an important point. One of the solutions, last Ciaran Corla, that the banks are beginning to roll out is the split mortgage, and I think it is a product that has a lot of potential. And as the Minister knows, and I had a topical issue debate here with the Minister some time ago, the banks are still adopting different approaches in relation to that. I raised that issue directly with the central bank, the fact that Bank of Ireland are charging full interest on the warehoused portion of the split mortgage, whereas the other banks primarily are not charging any interest at all. I think that there should be uniformity in the way in which a solution such as split mortgage is being rolled out, and I would call on the central bank again to ensure that we have that uniformity. And I think it's part of the reason why the number of split mortgages actually being agreed is not as high as we would like it to be. The official figures show it was only 309 actually at the end of June last. And I think the point made by, I think it was Deputy Boyd Barrett at the committee, that the uncertainty as to how the warehouse lump sum will come into play 10 or 15 years down the road is a concern for borrowers. And I have met people who have been offered split mortgages and who have refused them because they have no certainty as to how that warehouse portion will be dealt with down the road. The other issue I think we are going to have to face up to, last Ciaran Corla, is the issue of strategic default. It was a common theme that a number of the banks returned to time and again during their presentation to the committee members. AIB, as we know, have previously said that about 20% of those in arrears, in their view, are strategic defaulters. And in my view, we need to get a handle on this issue. We need to get independent verification as to the extent of this problem. I'm not burying my head in the sand and saying that there are no strategic defaulters out there. I am sure that there are people who have made the choice, for whatever reason, not to prioritise the repayment of the mortgage. But I am absolutely saying that there is an onus on the central bank to get to the bottom of the issue. And it is very easily done. They should be examining a sample of the arrears cases and arriving at a conclusion as to whether or not those people are strategically defaulting. Because it is unfair, in my view, to cast a slur on up to 20% of those in arrears and claim that they are deliberately not paying their mortgage despite having the means to do so. That assertion should be evidence-based. So far, there has been no evidence whatsoever brought to substantiate that, and the central bank has an onus, in my view, to examine that claim, agree on a definition of strategic default, and examine how widespread its application actually is. I acknowledged during the hearings last Ciancórla that some of the banks, particularly AIB, should be far more proactive in the appointment of rent receivers. If landlords who are receiving rental income from their tenants are not passing that on to the bank by way of a mortgage repayment, then the banks should use their powers to intervene and to actually seize that rental income and put it towards the mortgage. I think that's accepted by most members in this House, and there has been a dramatic difference, again, in the application of rent receivers by the banks. Bank of Ireland has appointed, I think, over 1,100, and AIB has appointed a couple of dozen. And, you know, again, we're not seeing any consistency in the way the issue is being treated. And if AIB, and I made this point at committee, is convinced that 1 in 5 of those in mortgage arrears are deliberately not paying their mortgage, and they acknowledged that a high percentage of those are actually buy-to-let properties, then why have they not moved in and actually appointed rent receivers to ensure that that income is put against the mortgage? They haven't done so, and they acknowledged that they haven't done enough work on that issue. Another issue I want to raise in the motion last Ciancórla is the issue of the new insolvency service. I welcome the fact that it is up and running and that it is now accepting applications. But when you look at the work that the Sunday Times have done examining the 37 licensed personal insolvency practitioners, there is a potential issue here in relation to people accessing the new insolvency service. And the reality is that those who need it most may not be able to access it because some of the PIPs are demanding money up front. The insolvency service is envisaging that they would be paid where there is an agreement reached as to the restructuring of a person's debts. But where there is no agreement reached, then how are they going to be paid? So the outcome is that they are, in all likelihood, going to cherry pick the customers that they will take on, will identify those who have some ability to pay the money up front and their fees, and I think that there is a need here for the state to ensure that those who most need access to the insolvency service get that access, and that the fees issue is not a barrier to that actually happening. Minister, I know that you yourself were critical of the banks as recently as this morning, and hopefully you will repeat some of those criticisms on the floor of the House tonight, because I think it is important that they are held to account in a fair way. Nobody is asking the banks to throw away the capital that they have been given by taxpayers. They have a duty to guard that capital closely, but they also have a duty to engage meaningfully with borrowers. And what we want to see is that where the individual cases merit it, that people are being offered, as Ulster Bank have been doing, permanent interest rate reductions through their economic concession, and that should be acknowledged. Debt for equity swaps should be implemented in our view, and split mortgages that do not actually punish people that have to enter into those arrangements. Solutions that are genuinely sustainable is what we want to see. The last point I want to make in the few seconds available, last Ciancórla, is that while the crisis is extremely bad as it is, it could get a whole lot worse if the ECB decides to start increasing their main financing rate, which is currently 0.5%. And you know that, Minister, as well. We are potentially sitting on a tracker time bomb. in relation to mortgage arrears, because I think it's up to half of those with mortgages have a tracker, and they might be paying somewhere between 1.25% and 1.75%. And heaven forbid, if the ECB starts to increase their rate by 0.5% a time, then thousands of people are going to get into real difficulty and will join those that are currently in difficulty, which makes it all the more important that we get the architecture of resolving the mortgage arrears crisis in order. And I think any independent assessment will find that we have not got that architecture right yet. There have been steps in the right direction. There is a lot more to do. This motion is not intended to be adversarial. It is intended to ventilate some of the frustration that was clearly felt by all members at the meetings that we had 2 weeks ago, and to bring about improvements in the way the central bank and the government are forcing the banks to deal with this issue.